All right, hello everybody. I hope you're doing well today. I'm really excited to start this conversation. The name of this panel is Tuning into Inclusion, Bridging Gaps in the Music Industry. And first I will introduce our panelists. So we have Lisa Murray, a singer, songwriter, producer, MPTI alumni, and she's part of, she's also currently working at Sony Music in London. Well, she just left.
But yeah,
well,
sure.
But yes, was working there for the past couple of years as an audio engineer and producer. And she's also part of the She Said So, as well as 2% Rising, which are both organizations that are about inclusivity in the music industry when it comes to women and gender diverse people. And then we have Ángela Cortés, who is the Chapter Development Director at We Make Noise, which is an amazing organization that provides music, tech, and educational possibilities for different not-for-profits as well as schools, and they do trainings and programs. We have Nicole, who is a current contemporary performance and production student, jazz vocalist, and also is a fundraising consultant and grant writer, and has done a lot of community work. I'm very excited to have you on this panel today. And we have Pablo Munguia, who is a renowned music producer and engineer, and he's also the current MPTI program director. So yes, let's welcome our panelists. Before we dive into the questions, I really want to offer some context of where we are at in the music industry when it comes to where women and gender diverse people place within songwriting, production, as well as just overall their presence in the music industry currently. So I thought it'd be a great idea to read some stats from the USC Annenberg Inclusion Initiative, which they've been doing a study basically for the past 12 years to assess how the changes are actually growing and at what rate. And so I do want to say that this is super exciting. 2024 actually marks the first time in 12 years that the percentage of women songwriters increased from 14.1% in 2022 to 19.5% in 2023, with a total of 55 being women of color. So that's good. And 56% of songs in 2023 included at least one woman songwriter, which is also an increase to the highest percentage in 12 years. But for women in producing roles, while it was also a high point this year, it's not a significant increase over the past few years. And we're going to be diving into why and hearing from our panelists why they think this. Only 14 of the producers credited in 2023 were women, and nearly half were women of color. So we're still seeing some change that needs to be made. And even with these slightest gains across the study that has been evaluated, 94% of the songs did not include even one woman producer. So to basically 29.8 men to every one woman, that's the ratio right now for a working woman as a producer. So last couple of stats. In 2023, 61% of these artists on the Billboard Hot 100 year-end charts were from an underrepresented racial and ethnic group, which is great. And the other minority was actually 39%, which were white. This was a 12-year high and an increase from 2022, but not significantly greater. And finally, I'd love to say this, but out of the 164 of these artists, it's unfortunate still that we have this disparity that 64.6% were men and 34.8% were women. So this is why we still have to have these conversations. It needs to be a panel every year. We need to be able to continue to talk about this. So let's get started. My first question is for all of you, but I'd like to start with Lisa. From your perspective through your role as audio engineer at Sony Music London over the past few years, your work with She Said So and 2% Rising, what do you see contributes to the lack of women producers currently? And do you see change on the horizon?
Yeah, I mean, I think production is a really interesting space because it is the worst represented area of the music industry, and that's where all of these conversations usually end up being directed around. A lot of it comes down to if you can't see it, you can't be it, and I think early education, kind of imposter syndrome, and all of these things feed into women not wanting to take the leap or feeling like, oh, I couldn't do that because there's a lot of gatekeeping in the industry still, across different levels, where people will kind of be like, oh no, you just can't, like, you know, I've met so many songwriters who have asked for specific technical changes or creative changes to projects they work on with men, and the men are like, oh no, that's not possible, you can't do that in Ableton, or you can't do that in Pro Tools. And that kind of toxic culture still really exists, especially for young female artists who would then pivot into production and producing for themselves. So I think a lot of the conversation, it's a lot of, even though there's been a lot of change and there is a lot of initiatives that have are working to improve this, I think it's a lot of the time it's an attitude thing, it's a culture thing, and it's finding the right communities who kind of will support you and uplift you and show you that it is very possible. And I always say to people, just start, because nobody is born knowing how a compressor works, right? Like, nobody comes into the world like, oh, I know exactly how to produce a beat, or I know exactly how to use Ableton. Every single person had to learn it. So it is a learned skill. It's not something, you can have a natural knack for it, and it can be something that comes naturally to you, but ultimately it's just about putting in the work, and just having the discipline and having the confidence to put in that work to get there. So that's what, like, the first conversation I have with any creative women that I meet. I'm like, just try, just start. You'll be so surprised at how quickly you can get from like 0 to 50% of your vision.
I love that. I think it's so important to find community, find the people that and the orgs that are supporting, you know, because that's where you can feel that sense of confidence and that sense of foundation to start, you know, to take risks, right?
Yeah.
Ángela, I'd love to hear your perspective on this from the music tech and education perspective, you know, being the director at We Make Noise.
Thank you for letting me be here. Actually, my impressions are that what is going on in the music industry is just a reflection of what happens in the society in general. So the way we feel as a woman, as a minority, or as a group of people that doesn't belong is exactly the same in all industries or in all different sectors in the society. So what we need to do is to create a path where people, minorities, and people that belong to minorities feel represented and feel that they really belong, and they, as Lisa said, don't have this imposter syndrome, or don't have this non-reflection of people to be like an example. So we need to create some examples so young people, young women, LGBTQ community, or some other minorities can feel represented. And it doesn't only applies to music. It applies to how you are teaching your kids to be, how kids are learning skills at school, and how you compromise with organizations and other institutions that really work to try to reduce this gap that we still have, not only in the music industry, but sadly in most of the industries that we have right now.
Thank you. Yes, that is absolutely true. It's way more beyond music, and it's really tied into the whole sociocultural fabric in the world. Kaya, I would love to hear your perspective, especially given that you've done so much community work, especially around racial equity.
Sure, thank you. Should I be this close?
I think that's good.
Okay. Thank you for having me. My name is Kaya. I'm a contemporary performance student. I have to say I have to agree with everything that my colleagues have already said with regards to the barriers for women, non-binary people, for people of color. I think it comes down to a couple of main aspects. One of them, specific to the music industry, is the industry as it stands is allergic to activism. And the reason it's allergic to activism is because it has not completely figured out how to monetize activism. Most of the time when we're talking about the music industry, what we're referring to is the music industry as it relates to how artists and their products can be monetized. We're not necessarily talking about communities of music. We're not always talking about music education. We're not necessarily referring to the existence of diverse artists in the world. We're referring to their access to resources. And so you know, when we have this conversation, there's two ways that we can look at it. I think it's an amazing thing that we have more female producers that are charting, that are being listed, but it's not because they never existed. They've always existed. And it does take, what progress takes is movements. And one of the most fun aspect about talking about movements is talking about the financial resources required to sustain movements. So that kind of leads into the grant writer role and why I've gotten into fundraising around art projects. It takes investment in local projects. It takes investment in communities that are intentionally feminist, that are intentionally anti-patriarchal. And so my kind of perspective when it comes to the conversation about diversity and inclusion is it's more than who's in the room, it's what the conversations are and the space that the conversations have for a diversity of perspectives as well.
Thank you, Kaya. No, that's... Yeah, round of applause for you right there. Absolutely. And also from a grant writer perspective, I'm always trying to work on projects that are not just about sharing one type of voice or one type of story, and to really work on projects that are different, you know, and that are providing more insight into different voices and different stories. So I really hear you on that. Thanks for sharing. Pablo, I'd love to hear your take, especially working in this music industry as a producer, a mixing engineer, and also as an educator in the MBTI program.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for putting this panel together. This is really great to be sitting here. I think from my perspective, I've seen this for a long time. I think a little bit longer than most folks here. And the change is glacial. I'm sorry to report, but while we can be discouraged by the constant negative news and the constant, setbacks. I mean, just yesterday we saw the Harvey Weinstein verdict overturned. I mean, it seems unbelievable that can happen, so it's easy to feel very discouraged, and yet. And this is kind of my optimistic side, is that we are seeing let's say, the other side fight back harder because we are making advances, we are advancing. And I believe that we have to continue to be strong allies and strong advocates and push hard with the advocacy, with the voice that isn't heard, because I think we're not just moving the needle, we're making a movement that's making the other side very nervous and very, very reactive. So I think it's the call is not to be discouraged, but on the other hand, to be encouraged by it.
Absolutely. I think it's important to look at the issues, the root of the issues, but to also be able to say, okay, but what can we do, because to feel the feelings, because there are a lot of feelings and there's a lot of anger, and, we should be able to express that, yet at the same time, remember that, we are put on this earth for the possibility to create that change, right? So thank you for that, Pablo. My second question is, from your experience, and we'll start with Lisa again, how do you feel about the level of respect afforded to women and gender diverse people in their roles within the music industry? What have you seen?
It really depends who you interact with, right? Kind of like anything, I've had situations where I have been mentored and worked with absolutely amazing people. I've worked at studios where people would walk in and say, oh, are you here as the assistant? And I'd be like, no, I'm going to engineer your session for the next 3 days and we're going to make your album together. I've had a 16-year-old guy who was actually doing work experience be trusted with all of the more technical things because he was male and I wasn't. And it's all subtle, right? Nobody ever says explicitly, oh, you're a woman, get out of the room. I do have friends who've had that. I've never had anything like that personally. But for me, something that I've learned in the last few years of my career since graduating from Berklee is that it's really important as a woman to decide when to walk away from a situation and to decide when something isn't worth it. And I think when you're starting out in your career, there can be this pressure of like, oh, but this could be my opportunity, or this is a really great artist, or I could get a good credit on this, or it would be really good for me to be in this room. But if you are not going to be respected in that room, if you are not going to be listened to in that room, find a different room, because they exist. And I've been really fortunate to work with absolutely amazing men and women alike. My main network of friends and collaborators in the music production industry are women, trans and non-binary folks. There is so much music being made right now in this very moment in the world. There are rooms that are going to welcome you. There are rooms that are going to see your value. There are rooms that are going to really want your input. So that's kind of the biggest thing that I've learned is knowing when, if it doesn't fit, don't force it because you think it's going to be a really big opportunity or because you think it's going to be a really good move for your career, because there will always be another opportunity. But then also there are different areas of the music industry I would know from working at Sony that have much more diverse backgrounds and much more diverse teams, and that are more heavily like female dominated. They tend to be more kind of traditional admin or like even a lot of marketing roles. Like I know in Sony there is a really diverse community of people who work across the labels in those kinds of areas, but you always look at production, A&R, these are always the areas that are really underrepresented, and they're always the ones I think that have the closest relationship with the actual kind of the creativity and the generation of the music. So I think that that's something that still really needs to be ironed out, because there is big change coming, but I think that it needs to be more proactive and more intentional to make sure that it kind of comes in more of a tidal wave rather than a slower movement.
Thank you for that. Angela, I'd love to hear your perspective.
Just the fact that we are here in this panel speaking about these things is a huge change. 10 years ago, probably we wouldn't have a panel like this with women and representing organizations that are creating changes. Organizations like the one that I represent, We Make Noise, or she make noise, She Knows Tech, We're Moving the Needle. There are so many right now that are really working hard to create a change based on education and based on skills that you need to develop in order to change, not only in the music industry, as I said before, but in your life and in the way you react to things that happens in your daily basis. So I think it's very important, and I truly believe that education is the key to transform all the things that we consider right now that are not fair. But my experience in the music industry has led me to think and truly believe that if you create like a path so people really know that there is a way that you can work and develop yourself and feel successful in the music industry, it will be very nice to have examples. So the women that are right now successful can be an example for young people that really thinks, oh, maybe I can do exactly the same thing that she's doing and feel represented. So I truly believe that the change, although it's not already done, it's something that we are working on, and I'm very optimistic about that. And I really think that let's think that in 10 years we may have this panel, but with more successful data, for sure.
Absolutely, and I definitely think that access, to these opportunities, like I know We Make Noise actually post jobs and like different things that maybe you wouldn't even know about because it's kind of, behind the scenes. So it's so important to have orgs not only just trying to get more women and gender diverse people into the doors, but to show like, hey, these exist for you and you will be mentored and guided, when you come in. Amazing. Kaya, I would love to hear your perspective on this.
Sure. Well, first, I want to acknowledge that when we're talking, the question was about respect in the industry as a woman, non-binary person, and gender diverse. So we're talking about the industry, right? But we have to acknowledge first that we're all coming from very different aspects of the industry. So we've got production, we've got working artists, we've got education, we've got labels. So, you know, we've got very diverse, these are actually different industries. So our experiences are diverse, but also our perspectives are diverse based on what we've experienced within the context of those industries. So I look at that as something that is in and of itself optimistic, because as musicians, we often feel like, oh, well, I can't get in this door. There's not just one building. Not only are there more than one door, there's other buildings, and the building is just on a single campus, and there are multiple campuses around the world. So that's one way to kind of look at it. I love, you know, what they were talking about with regards to, if this room is not accepting you, there's another room, there's another campus, there's another world, there's, you know, and it doesn't always feel like that, because of course, we begin from the context of our own communities. And so, you know, the community that I come from is the jazz community. I'm from New York originally, spent some time in New Orleans with the jazz community, and it is a very stereotypically patriarchal community. It has always been this way, and it's better than it's been, but it's still probably one of the more patriarchal communities that exist. With regards to representation of gender diverse people, there's almost none. And it's not to say that they don't exist. Queer people, of course, have and always will exist within the context of the jazz community, but it's not put out there, in part because of this same piece with regards to how capitalism is about presentation. So we had our Billy Strayhorns, who were not outwardly or spoke about being homosexual, but Billy Strayhorn, now that many years have passed, we all know that he was homosexual. And the question is, to what extent did his community know it? The question is, did they all know it and love him and accept him? Did he have to hide it most of the time? We've made changes, and we've made paces forward. Can I say that this is a community that has done the kind of, you know, overhaul that would be necessary for it to be a safe space for people? Not really. But my response to that, because I also have experienced misogyny within the industry, particularly as somebody who enters the room and enters the building with activism and feminism as forward, is that music is described in waves for a reason. These waves are not just sounds, but they're also cultures. If your culture, and whether you describe that culture as the relationship you have to your race, maybe you describe that culture as the relationship you have to your queer or gender diverse community, if your culture is not being represented by the wave that you're caught up in, there's another wave. Or maybe it means you're starting a wave. And so I think a lot of times, and I'm careful talking about this too, because not everybody wants to be a pioneer. But unfortunately, when we show up in the room and we are the only African American, when we show up in the room and we are the only gender diverse person, we're the only person who speaks a different language or comes from a different place, we are pioneers. And in a musical sense, that's going to mean something. So we have to learn how to market who and what we are. I got great advice from someone at the Pro Weekend conference that Berklee had last semester. Giannis, he told me that if you are experiencing oppression or experiencing resistance simply as a result of who you are, be more of who you are.
I love that.
Be bigger, because you're not talking to the right people yet.
Wow, Kaya.
I love to kind of jump on the back of what you're saying, because this is exactly what I wanted to say. You know, Lisa, you talk about, like, if you feel like you're in the wrong room, there's another room. With Kaya, I feel like what I want to say is, don't leave the room. Stay in the room. Be louder.
Yes.
It's because you're in the room, somehow you've entered the room, and now whether you want this job or not, as an ally, your job is to infiltrate this room and start the change from within the room. That's the biggest contribution we can make once we're in the room. And so however you got in the room, take advantage of that. And this, I think I invite everyone who finds themselves in a room where they're the only one who is that in the room, who feels disrespected, who feels they're not seen, who feels they're not being treated properly, to stay in the room and make the change from within the room. Because if you walk out of the room, you don't exist in the room anymore. And so I think that there's an opportunity there for us.
I'm gonna have to
irrelevant.
Or exactly
By your exit.
Exactly. Or blow up the room.
Yeah, I'm gonna slightly disagree with you, Pablo, on this. I have been in many rooms, and I'm always the most unapologetic version of myself. I will never be quiet about my opinion, especially when it comes to music or production or how something should be done. But I've spent most of my career with men and being the only woman in every room that I've been in. Like, that's been my genuine experience since I've been out in the big bad world as a producer and engineer. And sometimes there's just too many bad eggs in the room, and it's not worth your energy, because I think as a woman, not only do you have to show up and be the best version of yourself professionally, but you come into that room maybe having gotten catcalled on the street before you walked into the room, right? You're starting a couple of steps back, either in terms of pressure that you felt that morning, the physical, cycles of being a woman as well. Like, you don't know what kind of energy it can take from somebody to show up into a room and just persistently try to break down a barrier that's never going to be broken, because the people are never going to see the light, right? And you can make great records and you can exist in there, but from my experience and from the experience of my fellow women and my peers in the music industry, we have all left a room and then forged the career that we wanted. So I don't know. I don't fully agree. I hear what you're saying, and I wouldn't ever encourage somebody to play small or to hide in the corner or to just retract from a situation. But once that project's done, find other collaborators, and that would be my advice on that.
Yes, I agree with you, and I also would like to say that why do women always have to be more and be louder? Just the fact that we are women doesn't mean that we need to prove anything to anyone. If we are in a room full of men, it doesn't mean anything. It means who is more good at something in that room. It's not, are you a woman, so you have to prove and demonstrate that you are better than me? Why? Just because you are a woman? No. If you don't feel comfortable in a room, leave it or create another room.
Yeah, it can be exhausting.
Yeah, exactly. And in the same way, there are some people and minorities that doesn't even know that there are rooms. They doesn't even know that there is a way to do things different, that they doesn't even know what a room is. So how they can be in a room if they don't know that the room exists. I'm trying to create an explanation of how, with education and with training, you can really demonstrate that there is a way, another way. We work with communities in South America where they doesn't even know what music production is. There are young kids that doesn't even know how to create the music or don't even have internet access. So if you create a safe space so they can learn that this possibility exists, they can show a room, get to know where there is a room, or create a room for themselves. So yeah, I totally agree with you.
Wow. I mean, I think both perspectives are valid, right? Yeah, round of applause, everyone. I agree with both perspectives. You need to know when to leave the room. You need to know when it's not worth the fight or your energy, or if you're going to burn out, it's not worth it. It's not worth to risk your health or your mental well-being to try to you know, push through. But sometimes there are moments where pushing through and being brave and being courageous is actually what's called for. And so it really just depends on the scenario.
Yeah, and one other thing I'd like to add, something that I think is a real issue in the music industry is this perspective of, oh, but you're so lucky to be here. You're so lucky to be there. And this happens all the time. You're so lucky to work at that studio. You're so lucky to collaborate with that artist. You're so lucky to be in that room. And well, luck doesn't really come into it. It's hard work that gets you into the room. And also, it's work. This is a profession. Like, this is it's an industry. These are jobs. So I think, you know, you wouldn't go to your friend who works in, you know, marketing for a soda company and be like, you are so lucky to have that job. You're so lucky to get to market that product. That doesn't really happen in any other industry except for the music industry. And I think it really perpetrates misogyny, and it creates an industry where minorities can be exploited because they're like, oh, well, I'm really lucky to be here, so I better not mess this up, and I better just suck it up and stick it out. Whereas if you just look elsewhere, you will find people who will be supportive and who will value you, you know, kind of way. So that idea of luck, I think it really perpetrates misogyny in the music industry.
It also creates this like thing of like, oh, the stakes are higher for me and I have to work like 10 times harder than my counterparts, which is actually even something I felt like can be fed in family, you know, dynamics like from the beginning. So yeah, thank you for that.
I just have something really quick I want to add to that.
Sure.
I totally agree, but I also do think it's a matter of discernment, right? Which room is it worth it to stay if you've had a bad experience? Which room are people going to hear what you've said? And I would also add to that, I'm not going to expand on it, which room is paying you to stay? And this is, I know that this is about diversity and not reparation, but if I have to work as hard as everyone else, educate everyone in the room about what my experience and what experiences of somebody of my background are, I want to be paid a premium. That's it.
That's it.
I don't want to clarify, but I do want to say that part of what I thought was wonderful about being in this panel, is to bring that perspective of, okay, so what does it look like from this side? And what I want to say is still, I completely agree with everything that you're saying. I hear everything that you're saying. And I strongly believe that, you know, you don't want to perpetuate any rooms or any patterns that already exist. But the folks that need to change are the folks who are in those rooms, and they need to hear you. And if you walk out of the room, they stop hearing you. And they basically don't see you as they haven't seen you. I'm not saying that you have to, and I agree, you have to look at each situation differently. But this conversation, if you're just speaking to allies, this sounds great. But the folks who need to hear you are the ones who are not wanting to listen. They're the ones who need to change. Again, it's not about women having to be more, it's about any allies, not just women, but not just minorities, but any allies, being in the room and saying, this has to change, and taking the time to educate the folks who are not listening.
For 75 an hour.
Yes. Well, no, I mean, it's not for 75 an hour. I mean, I'm not even talking about how much you're making, because this, by the way, this is not about money. This change that we're talking about is not about how much money you're making in the room. The money you're going to make in the room will come with the change. You know, you're not going to get paid to make the change.
See, this is where we would disagree.
Okay. Well, this is great, but I'm saying the change, you're going to get paid because the change is happening.
I mean, I
So,
think it's.
I'm happy. By the way, I love that we're disagreeing.
This is more of a debate than a
love
panel,
it.
which I
This is how it
love.
works.
We're here for it.
I want to say that it's also like a little bit of that chicken, is it the chicken or the egg, you know? And I definitely see that, like, I think, you know, pay is tied into it, because ultimately that is one of the fights, you know, is to be paid, you know, at the same as our counterparts, sure. Right? But I do think that I don't think it's causal. Like, I think it can be that you demand more pay and you do the work at the same time, or the other way around. I think it just really depends on the context. But I wanted to jump into another question because this part's really important to me. So intersectionality, we know this as a term, and it's a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves, and this actually goes right into what you're saying, and creates obstacles that are often not understood among conventional ways of thinking. And ultimately, equality rests on this idea that we can observe these different needs that all of these communities need, which includes accessibility, race, class, gender identity, sexual orientation, and visible and non-visible disabilities. And the idea is that we want to level the playing field and take these aspects into consideration. So I want to ask you all, what do you think are some concrete steps that organizations, institutions, music companies, studios, whatever context you're coming from within the music industry, what steps can they take to truly and actively promote diversity and inclusion?
Want me to start?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, so from having worked at a major label for almost 3 years, there is a lot of change happening, and it's something that I didn't really see. It's something you don't really see from the outside in when you're looking at the music industry. You kind of think of major labels as these big evil places, these big scary buildings where all these big decisions happen. But I have to say, like, Sony has some of the leading policies on maternity leave, menopause policies. There are so many different educational initiatives that happen in the office. There are so many benefits, and they have equal parental leave for any parent, and depending, like, regardless of when you want to take it. Like, within the first year of your child being born, you can take a year off. I think you get maybe 50% pay after the first 6 months, and it's like there's really, really amazing initiatives, and they really are a leader. And I sit on a diversity task force for UK Music. I represent the Music Producers Guild on that, and UK Music put together this task force of different organizations like AIM, the Ivors Academy, Music Producers Guild, and all of the major labels and all the other PPL, PRS, all of these different music organizations, and they actually have a 10-point plan that needs to be implemented, which includes things like leadership, like gender diversity in leadership panels. And Sony did a massive restructure to facilitate that. Now there are more women in managing director and director roles of the labels than ever, and there is a lot of concrete steps that are happening in the background, especially when it comes to organizations. It's a lot easier, but the question always then comes down to how can freelancers be supported. So I think the organizations are doing a lot, the labels are doing a lot, all the companies are doing a lot. Anybody that has a HR department is doing a lot of work because there's somewhere to go, right? There is a team, there are heads of diversity and inclusion at every major label. There are people in these positions who are perpetrating this change and making it happen, but the majority of the music industry is freelancers, and that is where the lines get very, very blurred, and that's where things kind of need to be unionized and sort of collected in one place, so that people can have somewhere to go if they feel supported, or if they have a question about an NDA that they signed, that they know where to go, because it can feel a bit like a lawless land when you're working as a freelancer. But yeah, organizations, communities like like She Said So, 2% Rising in the UK. There are lots of different places where you can get involved and you can have these conversations with people and really kind of figure it out. But I think the main thing is that the change is happening on the sort of higher levels of the music industry. I'm hoping it will trickle down as time goes on, but it is important to remember that the majority of our industry are freelancers and people who are self-employed, and they don't have that same structure and that same backup and that same community of places that they can go to make sure that they are being treated fairly, or that things that are happening are normal, or that they need support for different things. So that's kind of where it's at, especially for the UK music industry. That's kind of mostly what I know about.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing. I think it's really important, this notion of freelancers, given that many musicians or people working in the industry are not employed by an organization, and they are, working on contract, and that ends up putting you in, the positions where you don't have access to those opportunities to be able to, or even benefits. Like, that's a huge issue. So. And
there is an organization that's being formed. It hasn't fully been formed yet, but it's called CISA, CIISA, and that is going to be this sort of central place for all freelancers in the music industry in the UK music industry to connect into for any of those kinds of resources.
Wow. Angela. I'd love to hear from you.
I think that we all have a role to make a change in the music industry. And my suggestions are, first of all, educate yourself. Get to know all the background and all the history that is in the music industry, and all the data that we have, all the reports that organizations and networks had created in the past, so you can know and learn about how is the landscape right now in the music industry. And also, in Spanish we have this word, I know that in English it doesn't mean exactly the same, but it's sorority. In Spanish, sororidad is the great representation and support between women and minorities, gender minorities. So I would really like to recommend to do sorority and to highlight and promote the work that other women and gender minorities are doing. If you are working not only in the music industry but in your daily basis or in the work that you do, highlight the work that other women are making. And if you have the opportunity to represent anyone or to give like an employment opportunity to someone, please highlight what these gender minorities are doing, because it's very important, not only for the music industry but for the society in general. That would be my main recommendation.
Hi, I would love to hear your perspective on this.
Can you repeat the first part of the question again?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, what are some concrete steps that organizations and institutions, it could be music companies, it could be studios, within the music industry, what can they take to truly and actively promote diversity? You know, not just diversity.
For sure. Well, I think the diversity and inclusion conversation is absolutely a conversation about equity. It's absolutely a conversation about money. Because we can't talk about having new faces in the room without discussing what these people have experienced that perhaps the other people in the room have not experienced, the effect that that's had on their mental state, their physical state, their housing situation, their financial situation. I think a lot of times in corporate and university environments, the academic or work conversations tend to be an abstraction from conversations of humanity. And I think that that's the first aspect that needs to change. So I think that diversity and inclusion needs to begin with a conversation about reparations. In New York right now, I'm not sure so much the other states. I know my country's not doing so well right now, but like Pablo mentioned a little bit earlier, it is a little bit of a pendulum swing. You know, you make a few steps forward and sometimes the pendulum swings backwards as a result of this kind of reactive measure. But I have a partnership with the New York Foundation of the Arts, and one thing I find really interesting in the beginning of any of our Zoom meetings, people will say, we are on the stolen lands of the Lenape, and this is becoming more of a common thing, these land acknowledgements within the context of corporations. We have already begun the conversation of including reparation as a part of salary, which 10, 20 years ago would have been considered insane and radical idea. But it is something that needs to be spoken about, and it's something that needs to happen if we're actually going to address what pain, suffering, and trauma is always happening within the context of these corporations, without the context of these corporations. The line between work and life needs to be dissolved, because if we are dealing with oppression outside and oppression inside, then what we are receiving as a result of our work needs to reflect our full human experiences.
Thank you. So, two parts. I want to completely agree that reparations have to be a part of the conversation, and there's many forms in which this can take. I mean, we can think only in the context of, you know, the history of the United States, but reparations, I think, is an applicable conversation to almost every country on earth. There are minorities that have been oppressed. There are groups that have been taken advantage of and on whose backs the wealth of nations has been created. So reparations is not, I think, a unique thing that is within the United States. I think this is a universal concept that we need to embrace. That said, I also want to say specifically to the question, my recommendation to anyone who is in a position of hiring, who is in a position of bringing in somebody into a project, because you might also only think, oh, only a manager is going to be ready to hire. But whenever you're doing a project, whatever the project is as a freelancer, who you bring into the project is how you are making a dent here, how you're making a difference. And so if you make the conscious choice to look, first of all, outside of your group, outside of your common group, you're going to be bringing this diversity. You're going to be bringing these varied voices into the room, and you are going to be helping the making these places a room where intersectionality can exist and can develop. So.
Thank you, Pablo. And that's all we have time for today. I just want to say thank you to She Knows Tech for including me in this panel, and thank you to all our panelists for sharing your perspective. Round of applause for everybody. And we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you.